Well, JP, that's not exactly a normal distribution, but it's getting close, isn't it? So there's some trust in some areas, and maybe some folks feel like there's not so much trust in other areas. So I've got to ask you again, why might a colleague of yours, not how you voted, but why might a colleague have chosen anything like uncertain or disagree or strongly disagree? Help me out. Run to a microphone, raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you. But I would love to know why there's this, more than half of us are a little bit concerned about whether there's trust that the organization will act.
They reported it before, nothing happened.
Oh, they reported it before, but nothing happened. Pichert is still behaving the same way. And so when we call somebody and say, thank you for lodging this report in the database, you know, we have a process. We're going to make sure that it gets reviewed and shared appropriately with Dr. Pichert. Can't tell you what comes of that because of concerns about confidentiality and privacy, of course, but we want you to know that if the behavior persists, please keep reporting, because that establishes a pattern, and a pattern is way different from a one-off, at least according to our policies. And that's why I think that the trend line for reporting has increased so much. But yeah, I would say that the biggest thing I hear from my nursing colleagues is that I've reported you before and you haven't changed. What's another reason that the team members don't necessarily trust? Again, not your experience particularly, but why you think a colleague might have responded that way. Again, perhaps fear of retaliation. Oh, I couldn't report because I was the only one in the room with Dr. Pichert when he did that, so he's going to know who reported, and I still fear the retaliation. Or there are just a limited number of people who are in the OR or in the exam area or whatever area you're working in. Why else?
There's a disconnect in communication.
How do you mean there's a disconnect in communication?
You reported, acted upon, but the person who reported it doesn't have feedback what the actions are because of confidentiality and privacy.
Dr. Cohen is correct. We often don't report because we don't get feedback that Pichert was taken to the woodshed or sent for anger management or went to counseling or he finally got his medications. You laugh, but you know, the unreasonable variation in medical record documentation went from just terrific to terrible in a few folks at an unnamed Southeastern Academic Medical Center. And those folks were ultimately diagnosed with adult onset ADHD. So it's not just the jerk factor. Sometimes there are health-related issues that once proper medication is provided, they've all gone back to the norms of medical record keeping. But every time I would be in the middle of doing my documentation and a colleague, a nurse, another staff member came up to me and asked a question, asked me to do something, I was eager to run off and do it and never get back. And I would get interrupted 12 other times and I would never, ever stick with the documentation issue that I'd started. And so got 3, then 30, then 300 records behind. Amazing, but it happens. So there are lots of reasons why this happened. My question for you is, what can you do as leaders to instill that trust that came on the very first slide that's a characteristic of highly reliable organizations? Building trust means that there is a whistleblower policy. Will there be Bad faith reports, they're rare, but they'll exist. There will be some people who just don't like me for whatever reason, and so the group decides that it's time to gang up. You have to deal with those, but they're pretty rare. So what can you do as a leadership to instill greater trust? This model to guide graduated interventions is what we're going to spend some time on after the break and before lunch. Processes to review data, our patient advocacy reporting system codes and analyzes patient reports. There are all these comment lines. If you get data, there sure better be somebody who's going to review them so that they can take action. It's like what we teach our first-year medical students. Don't do a test unless you're going to do something with the data, right? Don't do a survey unless you're going to do something with the data, right? So if you've got these data sets out there, make sure they're reviewed and acted upon. This pyramid is something that we published in Academic Medicine and have found very useful for the last 6 or 8 years. The good news is that what this is a plan, it's a path for addressing our colleagues. What I love about this personally is that the bottom sides of that triangle, that pyramid, have arrows, and if those arrows extended to the sub-basement of this building, it would still not capture the vast majority of the awesome professionals with whom we're all privileged to work. I mean, you are these people. At least 97% of you are. These are awesome individuals that you get to work with. Their competence is just magical. Their interpersonal skills are just terrific. Their values are solid. And so we just need to give them a little bit of feedback on progress and not get in their way. But every once in a while, because we're human beings, there's a slip or a lapse, and there's this unprofessional example of behavior or performance. And for that, you heard it earlier, describe what we fondly call a cup of coffee conversation. That is a conversation that's informal, a conversation that is one that you could literally have over a cup of coffee with a colleague. Now, my nursing colleague says, I don't have time to have a whole cup of coffee with a colleague, and you're right. I'm talking about 90 seconds to 3 minutes to just share an observation, and we'll talk about how that goes. Now, those of you who have legal or HR concerns, if the event is truly egregious, or it's one of those things that by law must be reported, you'll see that there are some oversized sections on that bottom part. So do you have to deal with single incidents when there's an allegation of substance abuse or harassment or inappropriate touch? Yeah, you don't deal with that over a cup of coffee. That's not what I'm talking about. But when a pattern exists and there's evidence of several stories or some data, then maybe I'd want to be aware that I stand out from my peers. Wouldn't you want to know if you stood out from peers? I think most of you would. And as a consequence, we have something that we call an awareness intervention when a pattern develops or appears to have developed. If the pattern persists, that's when we need to take advantage of your leadership skills for having some sort of intervention that's guided by an authority. And if the pattern persists despite all of that effort, then sometimes we have to go to the governing documents, the bylaws, the employee manuals, the disciplinary section of our policies and procedures. But wouldn't it be great if we could head most of those off at the pass? And so I'm not going to get to the edicts kinds of conversation. Edicts is a mnemonic. I got through Bucknell using mnemonics. So the E is, there were some expectations, There have been some deviations from those expectations. There needs to be some sort of intervention, as we discussed. There are some consequences, good if you follow through, not so good if you don't. There's a timeline, and there's surveillance, some measures so that you'll know how you're doing and we'll know how you're doing. We'll talk a little bit about that awareness level intervention for authorities or pre-authority. And then this informal cup of coffee conversation. And then because sometimes as bosses you need to step it up a notch, it won't just be a regular cup of coffee, but a cup of espresso. We'll make a little bit of a distinction between those. So back to the case. I offered a pair of gloves. Dr. Pichert took them, dropped them into the trash can.